All right, so I think it is time to begin our session. Thank you all so much for coming. This particular session is titled Abolish Civilizing Violence. It's in the form of a demand, but we are gonna have a couple of folks speak. Right now, I want to first introduce myself. My name is Sharon Cheryl Onga Nana, and I am a member of the event organizing team and the moderator for this particular session. I want to make you aware that I think closed captioning is available. To view a live transcription, click the live transcript button on the bottom menu and select show subtitle. Also, in order to secure the space, you might not be able to rename yourself once you've entered. We do apologize if you're unable to add your pronouns to your name already, but we urge you to do so before you log on into the next session. So at this time, we have already picked the order as to who's going to go first. All our presenters are going to present their particular topic, and after that, we will open it up for chat discussions. Yes, this session is definitely being recorded, so if you want to be seen while you're asking your question, please let us know. If you don't want your name or your voice to be sort of part of the recording, note that in your question, and we will make sure not to release that information. I will stop talking and hand it over to the first person who's presenting.
Okay, so hi, I'm really glad to be able to be here. I've had a chance to participate very briefly in some of the other sessions in a virtual way. My name's Gary Kinsman, and I'm a longtime queer liberation, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist activist. I am currently a member of the No Pride in Policing Coalition, which is an abolitionist queer and trans organization in what is, in settler speak, referred to as Toronto, Canada. But I am actually speaking to you tonight, today, from the territories of the Atikamekw, Anishinaabe, and other Anishinaabe nations and people. In settler speak, this is known as Sudbury, Canada. In my work and activism, I trouble Canada and support Indigenous struggles. I use he or they as pronouns. I am white and middle class, and I'm 65 years old. In this presentation, I'm drawing on my ongoing work on the making and unmaking of what I refer to as the neoliberal queer, and especially work that I've been engaged in for the third edition of my book, The Regulation of Desire. I use queer in this presentation to take back a term of abuse and to neutralize it as a term of abuse that has been used against us, and as a broader term than homosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans. I make my points here more generally, but they are grounded in historical and empirical research and in organizing. I'm grounded in so-called Canadian political context. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to ask them in the question and answer period. And what I'm speaking about is going to be made in more general points here, but it's grounded in historical and empirical research and in organizing. To begin with, we need to answer the question, what is the neoliberal queer? This firstly requires grasping what neoliberal capitalism is all about. In response to the massive wave of struggles in the long 1960s, including anti-colonial, anti-war, student, Black and red power, working class feminist and queer struggles and revolts, that together began to put in question racist capitalist social relations. There was a shift in ruling circles in terms of their strategies towards a new capitalist strategy, which came to be called neoliberalism. This was based on pushing back and tearing apart the gains won by working class and oppressed people's struggles. Many talk about neoliberalism as simply the cutting back of social expenditures, the cutting back of the social wage, privatization, and a so-called shrinking of state relations. What this misses out is that at the very same time, this neoliberalism was also a major focus and had a major focus on law and order, on the expansion of policing, on the expansion of prisons, and on the expansion of carceral relations, as well as the tightening up of borders against Black and other people of color from the global South. What this actually did then was expand the disciplinary aspects of state relations. And this is often missed out by certain people, I believe, when they describe what neoliberalism is all about, especially those sort of more liberal defenders of neoliberalism. There are at least two currents within neoliberalism that emerge. The first one that historically emerges is a moral or social conservative one that focuses on defense of the family, on patriarchal relations, on whiteness, on heterosexuality, and on defense of law and order. Resistance from our movements, from feminist, anti-racist, queer, and other movements, leads to the emergence of a non-moral conservative form of neoliberalism, what some refer to as a more liberal strand of neoliberalism, which comes to support limited rights for women and queers. It is this strand that allowed for the emergence of what I call the neoliberal queer, since it is this layer within queer community formation that simply wants to be let in to the white middle class, and therefore comes to accommodate itself with and comes to defend and support capitalist and state relations. But central to this current of neoliberalism as well, it needs to be emphasized, is still the expansion of policing, prisons, and law and order, which also means a major investment in anti-Black racism. Central to the emergence of this neoliberal queer, I suggest, is a shift from the early gay or queer liberationist politics, where our liberation was actually seen in the 1970s as bound up with the liberation of all other oppressed people. There were lots of limitations and contradictions to that, but that was the basic sort of liberationist perspective, to a more limited and much more narrow rights-based politics by the later part of the 1970s. This was also a shift from opposition to the police to support for the police through liaison and dialogue committees, and in a broader sense, support for the criminalization and use of carceral relations against sex workers, against poor people and homeless people, drug users, and often against Blacks and other people of color. Some white middle-class men, and I can actually go into this in more detail in the Canadian context, came to play a central role in campaigns against sex workers and homeless people in Vancouver and in Toronto, joining in a racialized class struggle in support of neoliberal capitalist relations, and at the same time defending their participation in practices of gentrification and defending their real estate property values. In Toronto, there was a shift from mass resistance to the bath raids in the early 1980s, when hundreds of men were arrested by the police for supposedly being in common body houses. Thousands of people would fill the streets to protest these mass arrests. A shift from that in the 1980s of mass struggle and resistance to actually welcoming the police into pride parades in the 1990s and 2000s. This process ripped apart community organizations who had democratic discussions that led to opposition to collaboration with the police. And even though these discussions and decisions have been made, neoliberal queer forces went ahead and collaborated with the police anyway. Some of this was based on the view that the Canadian Charter of Rights and its equality rights section, which was enacted in the 1980s, and please feel free to ask me questions about this, which was a partial shift in Canadian legal state formation, was the social form. It was the social form through which rights and liberation would be achieved and won. This unfortunately accepted the social form of Canadian state formation, which is built on the colonization and genocide of the Indigenous peoples as the social form through which our rights were supposed to be won. This created a colonial form of settler homonationalism, to borrow Jasper Poir's term, that put many queer people in opposition to Indigenous struggles for land, water, and self-determination. This unfortunately continues to this day. Legal strategies focused on formal rights and equality, while substantive forms of inequality increased within queer and trans communities and elsewhere as a result of neoliberal racialized capitalist policies. Rights struggles benefited some queer people far more than others, and that of course is just the case just as much in the United States as well. And a one-sided racialized class struggle took place with emerging neoliberal queer forces reconstructing queer communities in their own interests and images. Now, this is something that I think we actually need to be more aware of. There's actually been what I would suggest is almost like a one-sided class struggle being waged against many of us in queer and trans communities since at least the 1990s. And we haven't actually joined in from the other side, and I'm arguing that we have to do that. There was a long struggle for an apology in the Canadian context for the national security purge campaigns in the public service and the military during the Canadian War on Queers from the 1950s to the 1990s, in which thousands of people were put under RCMP, that's the Canadian National Police surveillance, and other forms of security surveillance, and lost their jobs and careers. Similar developments took place in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. When the state apology was finally announced in 2017, decades late, it was used to try to suggest that all this could now be forgotten and queers should actually join the military. The reception after the official apology in November 2017 was actually held in an active military installation, and some who attended were actually handed military recruitment flyers as they were leaving. There has been an active attempt through this apology process to incorporate some queers into Canadian patriotism and the military. Given prohibitions on queer immigration, rooted in Cold War national security campaigns against queers as supposedly being risks to national security and national security threats, there was a long struggle in the Canadian context to challenge and change immigration and refugee laws. The legal acceptance of the formal rights of queer and trans people to claim refugee status in the Canadian state in the early 1990s coincided with the tightening up of borders against refugees and migrants, largely against people of color coming from the global south. This set up a major contradiction between formal rights and substantive rights with the tightening up of the borders. While people have the formal right to apply for refugee status in the Canadian context for being queer or trans, for many, it is substantially impossible to do this. They can't get to the Canadian state, they can't get visas, they simply are not going to be accepted as people who could claim refugee status in a real sense. And for those who are actually being processed for refugee status within the Canadian state, they have to demonstrate they are really queer according to Northern and Western standards. This is why I would argue a no one is illegal and a no borders approach is actually crucial to advance these struggles. But these approaches are opposed by neoliberal queers with their heavy investment in racialized class relations and Canadian state formation, including its borders and boundaries. Most recently, there's been a revolt by those who were left out of the formal rights revolution. And that includes queer and trans people who experience oppression on the basis of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and other forms of racism, on the basis of class, poverty, gender, ability, and other lines of oppression. Central to this revolt of those who'd been left out was the action by Black Lives Matter Toronto in 2016 in the Toronto Pride Parade, when they stopped the parade for close to 30 minutes to demand more funding for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color community events within Pride, but also, and this is what most people have heard about, in the midst of police killings of Black people in the United States and within the Canadian state, for the police to be booted out of the Pride Parade. After that disruption of and stopping of the Pride Parade, there was lots of white, mostly queer men's racist pro-cop sentiment that was expressed. It was quite hateful and it was very difficult to live through. But anti-racist queer and trans activists were able to get all of the demands of Black Lives Matter Toronto adopted by the Pride Toronto membership by about 80%. And we have managed to hold this position, although it's been difficult, despite the various levels of the state, both municipal and federal, trying to get the police back in. In the context of the current pandemic, the global uprising against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and police violence has created a new situation by opening up more space for a much clearer abolitionist approach regarding policing, prisons, and carceral relations more generally. And it created space for these abolitionist positions to become popular mass approaches. This has created a new dividing line, and more mainstream LGBT groups and organizations that are still trapped in the limited reform the police position, which in this context actually becomes a very pro-police position, are now more clearly on the other side from those of us who are adopting an abolitionist approach. They are defending racist capitalist relations and policing. This means that it is now more clear that the neoliberal queer is on the side of policing, prisons, and carceral injustice, and this makes the stakes in our current struggles both higher and clearer. For queer and trans movements to stand on the side of Black and Indigenous and other people of color people's lives, and that includes lots of queer and trans Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and standing on the side of their lives and standing in defense of their lives, requires calling for defunding and abolishing the police and carceral relations. This opens up possibilities for imagining abolitionist futures through facilitating our own racialized class struggles by queer and trans people in alliance with other working class and oppressed people. Finally, we can more clearly join in as the other side of that racialized class struggle that neoliberal queers initiated decades ago. Central to this is building alternatives to policing and carceral state relations based on mutual aid, social solidarity, and care. In conclusion, I want to suggest that building more active support for queer and trans abolitionist futures means at the very same time fighting against and unmaking what I've referred to as the neoliberal queer. Now, I'm sure you probably have all sorts of questions and there's need for discussion of this, but I want to thank you for listening and I look forward to the discussion later and for hearing the other presentations on this panel. Thank you.
Next up, I think, is Kanav Kathuria. Let me know if I'm saying your name right.
Yeah, Kanav, Kathuria, you're good. I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. Can y'all see the presentation? Yeah, okay, thank you. Give me 1 sec. I'm gonna pull up my notes. All right, thank you. Thank you for bearing with me. Welcome, good evening or good afternoon where you are. Thank you all for joining this session, Prisons, Food Sovereignty, and Abolitionist Geographies, Food as a Tool of Resistance. Thank you as well to the conference organizers for having me. Grateful to be here, and I've learned a lot from other sessions already. So to begin, I'll first introduce myself and run through the agenda for the session. My name is Kanav Kathuria. I'm the founder of the Farm to Prison Project, a Baltimore-based organization on Baltimore, but Lumbee, Cherokee, and Piscataway land that connects urban and small-scale farms to prisons under an abolitionist framework. So we'll be talking about a few things today. First, we'll briefly cover prison food and the experience of eating in confinement. Specifically, we'll discuss how this experience is one that's rooted in death, and how prisons use the very bodies and minds of incarcerated folks as a site of control, punishment, and capital accumulation for private food service and commissary providers. We'll next speak to how the true impact of the violence of prison food only becomes clear when we look beyond the wall of confinement to spaces of food apartheid. I'll use Baltimore, where we're based, as a case study to dive deeper into this intersection. Third, I'll touch on the larger intersections pretty briefly between carcerality and our food systems in the US. We look at the interplay between correctional enterprises, prison labor, and agriculture as one example. And to conclude, I'll say a few words on food sovereignty and how the struggle for food sovereignty must inherently be a revolutionary abolitionist project. So we have a lot of ground to cover here. Unfortunately, we won't have time to do a deep dive into each of these topics, but we'll get as far as we can. To begin, prison food and correctional food systems more broadly are a historically under-researched and intentionally obscured topic. We begin with prison food in order to extend outward. There's a lot to be learned in understanding how and why correctional food provision operates the way it does, and as we'll touch on later in this presentation, how it complicates the struggle for self-determination and for food sovereignty beyond the formal walls of confinement. So over the past few years, more and more media attention has focused on the experience of eating in prisons. Articles, papers, researchers, advocates point to the dehumanizing reality of prison as lived through food provision, and of course, currently and formerly incarcerated folks themselves, focusing on portions that are not enough to feed a child, much less an adult, rats, mice, maggots, and bugs in people's meals, especially here in Baltimore. Folks being served food that's marked not for human consumption, and literal rat poison in prisons across the country, especially in California and New York, and countless other examples documenting the quotidian brutality of eating on the inside. For example, these two pictures here, the one on the left is sent from a comrade on the inside around what food looks like today. Or sorry, a few years ago, and the picture on the right is neutral loaf, which is a form of punishment through food. Now, while shedding light on prisons through food is important, the majority of the attention that's placed on prison food does little more than actually legitimize and reify the logics undergirding these institutions of brutality. We say this because the vast majority of attention situates the conditions of confinement as aberrations from the inherent logics of violence, exploitation, and disposability giving rise to prisons themselves. So in doing so, people advocate for a kinder, a gentler prison, a purely moral, liberal, and generally white argument that fantasizes a world where prisons are actually able to meet people's needs. We found that this trend remains even true among those more critical of mass incarceration. In short, reformers center their critiques on either the harms of privatization or, as Rachel Herzing and Ruth Wilson Gilmore write, on tweaking Armageddon, tinkering at the margins of these death-making institutions through policy reform. Now, understanding this mainstream approach toward reforming prison food is key because, as Jared Sexton writes, you better understand white people's fantasies because tomorrow there'll be legislation. So let's present an alternate view. As abolitionists, we know that prisons are, as Joy James writes, the modern day manifestations of the plantation. We can analyze prisons from the lens of racial capitalism, positing that prisons exist to warehouse a racialized and disposable surplus population. We can also analyze prisons from an Afro-pessimist or necro-political lens, maintaining that prisons are formed on the singular bedrock of anti-Black civil, physical, and social death. Ultimately, at a basic level, we know that our criminal justice system and prisons specifically creates more harm than it claims to solve. And these two pictures are of food currently served in Texas prisons under COVID-19. So generally, as a society, it's common knowledge that prison food is and has always been deeply inhumane. And that has been this way since the inception of prison and the days of bread and water. We also know that food provision has evolved alongside changes in the racial and social composition, economic composition of prison, from slavery to convict leasing to modern day prison agriculture, which we'll cover in part 3. At the Farm to Prison Project, through our work inside and outside of Maryland state prisons, we maintain that prison food today serves 3 fundamental functions. 1, as a means of dehumanization, control, and punishment. 2, a means of state violence. And 3, as a structural and invisibilized form of premature death. And it's this last function that I want to center today. For to understand just how prison food is designed to kill those the state holds captive, we also understand how food, one of our most basic necessities, can be systematically weaponized to dehumanize and create the conditions for violence. So moving along to part 2. Now, the true violence of prison food becomes clear when we analyze how carcerality extends again beyond the physical presence of a prison. As abolitionists, we know that prisons are but one hyper-visible aspect of the prison industrial complex. We also know that from the 1970s onward, as Jackie Wang writes in Carceral Capitalism, the social function and legitimacy of the state evolved from being a provider of social services, or the welfare state, to a provider of security, the debt carceral state. Carcerality then is no longer a mere function of the state. Instead, the state itself is defined by carcerality as a larger power relation, a feature that's visible in all aspects of US life, such as schools, hospitals, human and social service institutions, etc. Whether through the military industrial complex abroad or through the prison industrial complex nationally, US imperialism and carceral relations form the common link between the destruction of non-white bodies nationally and globally. Another carceral geography, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it, is characterized by spaces of food apartheid, which I'll define in a bit. To explore the relationship between prisons and food apartheid, we'll use Baltimore as a case study and look on the one hand at the development of food apartheid in prison as a product of redlining, deindustrialization, and neoliberalism, and on the other hand, the simultaneous industrialization and bifurcation of our capitalist food system on the development on prison food. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I want to point out, I want to point to the origins and evolution of food apartheid before and after Jim Crow segregation. The map on the left depicts one of the first instances of redlining, a form of racial segregation actually originating in Baltimore in the early 1900s and then brought to a national scale by the Federal Housing Administration. Between 1934 and 1968, the FHA excluded Black people from receiving home loans, which barred people from home ownership, which was and is one of the most common routes to wealth accumulation in this country. So until the mid-1900s, we see that the racial order was primarily structured by the state, and hypersegregation was constructed and maintained through legal mechanisms such as redlining. Now on the right, we see a map of food deserts in Baltimore in 2015. And food deserts here is the state's language. We see how the neighborhoods in red, all predominantly Black, are by and large the same ones marked for discrimination almost 100 years ago. Today, despite the formal and performative end of Jim Crow through dismantling its visible legal infrastructure, our food regime remains hyper-racialized and characterized by, as Dara Cooper from the National Black Food and Justice Alliance writes, the hyper-saturation of destructive foods and predatory marketing, and a blatantly discriminatory corporate-controlled food system that results in communities of color suffering from some of the highest rates of heart disease and diabetes of all time. In this way, the logics of premature death no longer operate solely through the exclusion of loans to Black communities, but through inclusion. Inclusion into predatory markets that dump cheap and highly processed foods into the same communities that were redlined. As Jackie Wang explains in Carceral Capitalism, and I quote, the difference between the crushing debt of the Jim Crow era and the current neoliberal racial order is that debt during the previous era was tied to Blacks' roles as producers in the economy, first as agricultural workers, sharecroppers, and then during Jim Crow as industrial sector urban workers. In this era, the debt is primarily tied to Blacks' roles as consumers. We also add here that the dispossession of land from Black farmers characterizing the transition between agricultural work and industrial work, or in other words, the proletarianization of the Black farmer, is part of the ongoing and continuous process of racialized agrarian expropriation, creating the conditions necessary for the growth of capitalism. For example, between 1940 and 1974, hundreds of thousands of Black farmers had their land taken from them. Due in part to the denial of loans due to race and the corporate consolidation and centralization of the food system, the number of Black farmers in the country during this 35-year time period fell by 93%. This was done in part to facilitate the development of a racialized industrial workforce during World War II and beyond. And if we fast forward a few decades, when that industrial workforce was no longer needed, as the US deindustrialized and the welfare state was dismantled, mass incarceration became the solution to manage the masses of newly unemployed people who were cut out of the modern economy and thus deemed disposable. So we next turn our attention to these next two maps, depicting incarceration rates by neighborhood in Baltimore. We see that, again, the same neighborhoods from the previous two maps form the basis for not just Baltimore, but Maryland's carceral project. What does this tell us? In short, we have the same communities that are vulnerable to hyper-exploitation and expropriation in the economic domain and vulnerable to premature death through incarceration in the political and social domains. Thus, as opposed to separate phenomena, food apartheid and food in prisons are interrelated instances of state violence rooted in the logics of anti-Blackness and racial capitalism. This also means that we cannot dismantle one form without the other. So how does this relate to prison food? Well, as cities like Baltimore deindustrialized, the welfare state was dismantled, and incarceration rates exploded, our food systems continued to industrialize. For example, the second half of the 19th century saw food production and distribution increasingly consolidate in the hands of a small number of giant agribusiness corporations. As the book Hungry for Profit describes, capitalism presents us with the paradoxical reality of a rapid growth of food production and perpetuation of overproduction on the one hand, accompanied by social exclusion and the growth of hunger on the other. The latter is not a result of population growth, but instead a consequence of the fact that the immediate object of food production is not human sustenance, it's not human well-being, but the growth of profit. So as prison populations exploded, prison staff were thus faced with a crisis of scale regarding how to feed the unprecedented number of people behind bars on as low of a budget as possible. In Maryland, for example, the jail population skyrocketed by 258% from 1970 to 2015, as this map shows, or this graph shows. The reaction to these crises were predictable, right? Many states privatized and outsourced food production to transnational corporations such as Aramark, Trinity, and Crystal, broadened and standardized their practices to meet capacity demands, and overall cut costs in almost every way. Today, the average cost per day for all 3 meals in a Maryland prison is $3.83, or $1.27 per meal. And in terms of the food budget across all Maryland prisons, the total food budget is around 6 to 7% of a prison's overall budget. So in this way, the act of feeding people in prison increasingly became disconnected from local food systems, industrialized, and a source of profit for companies across the supply chain. Food conditions were impacted on all levels of the production process. For example, the quality of food worsened significantly, portion sizes decreased, and any supposed nutritional value was replaced with the mentality to simply keep people alive. In short, the dehumanizing character of prison food evolved with and adapted to the rise of mass incarceration, the entrenchment of food service in the prison industrial complex, and the ways in which food systems under racial capitalism continue to structure food conditions both inside and outside of prison today. In short, to wrap this section up, through the more or less forced consumption of nutritionally bankrupt food in prison, prison food serves as a collateral consequence of incarceration, an invisibilized collateral consequence that continues to shorten life expectancies long after people are released from bondage. So I'm not gonna, we don't have too much time to get into part 3 fully, but while we don't have time to cover the intersection between prisons and our food system, we can talk briefly about the evolution of prison agriculture from slavery to convict leasing to the present. The one thing I want to note here is that prison farms today serve different purposes across the country, but are mainly used to produce food for public, not private purposes, mainly to support the correctional food system itself, from growing to preparing to serving food. As James Kilgore explains, this is the quote, "Far more individuals work in producing goods and services for government departments and institutions. Here we find some of the nation's most oppressive working conditions. Prisons such as Angola and Louisiana and Parchment Farm in Mississippi cruelly imitate the conditions of slavery, replete with the majority Black agricultural workforce being supervised by armed white men on horseback. They generally grow crops for consumption by government entities, including prisons." Now, while Maryland doesn't have the same agricultural programs or landscape as more southern states, incarcerated folks in a number of facilities in this states are also leased out for gleaning. Gleaning is a practice where leftover produce is hand-picked on a field after a machine goes through for harvesting. The connections between deploying incarcerated individuals for gleaning and prison agriculture are clear, and the food that's gleaned is then donated to food banks. So to end the session, I'm going to pivot a little bit and begin with the definition of food apartheid. Food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. As we've spoken to, our food systems cannot be divorced from capitalism, and by extension, as Lenin and Kwame Nkrumah teach us, imperialism and neocolonialism. Examples of the use of food as oppression are everywhere, from the International Monetary Fund dumping Western produce in post-colonial countries as a way to resolve the crisis of underconsumption, to the US bombing of Laos as an anti-communist initiative, where farmers today cannot farm their fields without fear of triggering the hundreds of thousands of unexploded bombs laying dormant in the soil, to the US embargo of Cuba as a means to quite literally starve the island into submission. Now, in recognizing that our food systems and carcerality on a global scale, or as Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, spaces of unfreedom, are deeply intertwined, the only form that can dismantle both and all systems of oppression is an abolitionist form, specifically a revolutionary abolitionist form, a form that acknowledges the limits of reform under capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, Satanism and ableism, queer and transphobia, and the state itself.
Correct.
And only by the, I'm sorry?
You want to, if you could, closing thoughts for time purposes.
Okay, sure. I have like 1 more minute, if that's okay. Okay. Only by the insurrectionary refusal of the traditional choices offered to us in this work, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey write in the Undercommons, can we think beyond reform and position food sovereignty as a process of communization, a stateless and classless project. I'm gonna move beyond food as resistance for time. Just my last sentence, ultimately, we adopt a politics that prioritizes food and land at the center of desire, beyond the traditional positioning of land as a national project, and moving beyond the nation state as a form to the acknowledgement of the healing potential of food and the ways we start with restorative, indigenous, and Black foodways and fractalize outward. By looking at food from this revolutionary lens, we can build a world where food is produced and distributed in a way that feeds and nourishes us, both physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Thank you all, and my apologies for running a little over.
No, you're fine. Thank you so much. And next up, we have SM Rodriguez.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and I'm so happy now that I've heard both Gary and Kanav's speaks. It's just, yeah, your talks were wonderful, and I think there are connections between all three, and we'll get into that soon. So hi, I'm SM Rodriguez. I am well, you can find the full bio in the website, but I'm an assistant professor of critical criminology and sociology, director of LGBTQ studies at Hofstra University currently. My affiliation will change quite soon though, and so I would ask if anybody wants to reach out to me, that you do so through my website, which would be through a different, 2 different emails. So I'm currently working on 2 book projects. And what I'll share with you today is from the one called March for Removal, Perpetual Coloniality, Gentrification, and Queer Abolitionist Praxis in New York City. So I'm just gonna do a reading that kind of pulls from this article that's called Queers Against Corrective Development, that is forthcoming in GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. And I'm still very much working through the idea, so I invite anyone who's interested to offer feedback or ask questions that you think may be generative. All right, so let me start my timer so that I'm aware of how time is. In January 2016, the nearly condemned property next door to me sold for $150,000, according to public records in Brooklyn, New York. In the following year, we watched our neighbor, affectionately called Hell Yeah by the block, as he was forcibly evicted. The owner did nothing to update or renovate the property, but instead focused on the riddance of the Black squatters and waited until the tide of gentrification traveled eastward from Bedside to us in Ocean Hill, enough to make even an unlivable property valuable. In 2018, he sold it for $1,090,000. My landlords, a European couple of Swedish and German descent, celebrated the removal of my neighbors, while other residents mourned that Helia's beloved cat wasn't safely retrieved from the basement before the full gut renovations began. Seemingly sparing no expense on the renovation, the new white landlord next door remarked to the Chinese construction laborer that he intended to rent out each of the 3 floors at $3,000 a month. Only a few years ago, this would have been so far-fetched. In 2019, the Swedish landlord laughed when he heard this. Dismissively, he exclaimed, "Yeah, right, not yet. Maybe if we can get a few more cafes up." And he passed over my and my partner's dismay. In this moment, we see the owning class, the police, the prospective business, the new high-income resident, the gentrifying bodies clearly. They collaborate to settle in and develop an idle land. Long-term residents wear racialization as a mark for removal. Displacement will occur through pricing us out, or, like the neighbor who has been transformed into squatter, through criminalizing whoever remains. However unexpected the bald-faced admission was, the relationship between cafe culture and economic disposition is furtive and historical. The earliest coffee shops mushroomed in the height of imperialism, a false marker of civility within uneven rule. European cities boldly featured the African delight that is coffee, acquired through the power and wealth accumulated by imperial expansion. Markman Ellis in 2004 remarks that such grandeur and elegance surrounded the cafe that building a cafe was often one of the quote unquote first things that Ottoman rulers did in newly conquered cities. Forgotten through a continued colonization, the Englishmen attributed coffee to the Oriental, the Muslims whose settling of East Africa predated their own. Perpetual colonization thrives on the usurpation of ownership over cultural goods and practices, with the naturalization of the new belonging. The cafe provides the opportunity to consume the exoticized Black culture. Materialized, coffee becomes simulacra of the colonized other. Brooklyn is just one perpetually colonial place offering a taste of Blackness. The many cafes with brand new commissioned murals or imitation graffiti with "spread love, it's the Brooklyn way," the famous Biggie lyric, host newcomers who don't remember the just before, the recent history erased like the paint from the brick that told us whose cousin or sibling or child died from gun violence on the block. Their names and faces washed off, laundered as so much of the state-enabled violence that created this Black death world. Invite layer. Most of us do not remember the name of the Lenape who thrived here in the long ago, despite the very street name Rockaway and the neighborhood Canarsie. Instead, the native New Yorker is created through notice of whom is displaced in the wake of shorter waves of settling forces. These waves, in turn, force migration. Gentrification relies on corrective development. The forced movement of Black, mad, poor, and/or queer bodies from that target geography to less desired areas, and by use of corrective violence. Corrective violence is structural and systematic, encompassing the utilization and tacit approval of regularized violence against oppressed peoples, as well as the violent enforcement of social immobility by protecting poverty in one of the richest states in the richest country of the world. I invite the term corrective development to combat the idea of gentrification as a passive occurrence in which higher income people happen to find the hood interesting or trendy or convenient. Instead, it's imperative that we acknowledge the underlying violence and how the power to dispossess is wielded. In this article, I also offer a snapshot of the abolitionist or anti-corrections work that queer people of color in Brooklyn have mobilized in order to empower the community against corrective violence. Ultimately, I offer this language and analysis of corrective violence so that we can understand the entanglements of queerphobia, racism, ableism, and disposability that queer transformative justice moves to abolish in Brooklyn. To usher in trendy cafes and other profitable gentrifying bodies, neighborhoods need both sides of correction. The punitive removal of racialized, poor, disabled people is met with the invitation of the desired resident. While the removal relies on police violence that criminalizes, brutalizes, and kills residents, the invitation, on the other hand, arrives through white investments. Suddenly, the city lends a regular sanitation effort. There's access to fresh or freshly prepared foods. The state makes available certain quality of life investments that would have transformed life for previous residents. Gentrification develops racialized areas for the colonial settling of those with high racial capital. The one-dimensional queer is a manifestation of this highly valued subject, as the presence of the white gay equality indexes begin to positively correlate gay presence with the economic potential of a successful or creative city. Racial capitalism within a neoliberal framework creates surplus out of the unassimilable. Surplus bodies, in turn, are capitalized upon through their rebirth as carceral objects. Within idle lands recently marked for neoliberal development, carcerality serves as an opportunity to expand employment. those within productive assimilated classes gain access to opportunities for violence work, which proliferate with the passage of new punitive governmental policies that increase the presence and technologies of law enforcement. Corrections in the United States most often describes the institution that holds custody of criminalized people, purportedly to reform or reorient them from non-normative behaviors through labeling, isolation, and constraint. Federal and state governments' corrections departments warehouse people with the retributive and/or incapacitating aim to neutralize the populations that can't be incorporated into the normate social body. This includes a disproportionate representation of people of color, disabled and neurodivergent people, queer people, and indigent people, those of proletariat and lupoproletariat classes. Therefore, in my use of the term corrections, I point to two intentions. One, forced assimilation of the unproductive body into the normate social body, or if found impossible, two, the removal of this body from the public in order to correct the balance of the social environment. Arriving home, 4th of July, my wife and I noticed two lovers, both women, fighting. I note that it was an American holiday, not for reverence of the date, but because holidays often accompany spikes in interpersonal violence. The lovers were noticeably intoxicated, especially the stud, as they walked from one party to a family barbecue in the neighborhood. An argument ensued because the femme lover did not want to go to the stud's family's barbecue. She wanted to stay home. At some point, the argument escalated and became physical. At the point of my arrival, the femme had been pushed into the street while attempting to use a parallel parked car as a buffer between her and her lover. She narrowly missed an oncoming car speeding above the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit for the city. It took 45 minutes and the twice unintentional shedding of blood to de-escalate the situation. 45 minutes on a New York City block is enough time to encounter a small town's worth of people. No one helped. No one stopped outside the cafe. My partner and I only succeeded in moving them away from the cafe's doorstep because of the country music, which served as a clear indicator that all of us were in danger of police violence at any moment. The back and forth of insults, the mutual cycles of aggression and self-pity, the little failures and successes to diffuse finally, they remind me of the imperative of Black-led queer abolitionist organizing in Brooklyn. According to Jairus Dixon, transformative justice works when neighborhoods execute bold, small experiments to practice community accountability and reduce or eliminate interpersonal violence. Jairus, the founding coordinator of the Safe Outside the System collective, believes in the power of community-based strategies for intervening in violence. This belief is grounded in a history of coordinated anti-violence movements that began largely in the 1970s, coinciding with the advent of mass incarceration and the growth of the carceral state. Transformative justice describes a system of responses to violence that relies on community and civil leadership, especially of those most impacted, to identify and transform the root causes of violence. The collective is the creation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit, transgender, and gender nonconforming abolitionists of color who have committed to fighting state and hate violence without the use of the police. Its 15-year history of enacting abolitionist anti-violence organizing has only grown stronger and more strategic through the rapid forced displacement of central Brooklyn's working class people of African descent. SOS employs transformative justice responses, acknowledging that interpersonal violence thrives in the context of structural violence. The poverty, ableism, racism, heterosexism embedded within coloniality exacerbate interpersonal division. TJ also allows practitioners to recognize that the retributive justice system can only further entrench cultures of violence. Therefore, community accountability organizers experiment and employ anti-violence tools in which the state doesn't invest. Empowering community members with verbal violence de-escalation strategies is one such bold, small experiment. SOS offers trainings regularly and grounds this work as the foundation of many of its community offerings. And you can go to alp.org to get more information about that, by the way, just gonna plug that. Trainings mostly focus on the how of engagement. How do you communicate anti-violence with your posture or tone? How do you avoid attracting violence workers? How do you deliver a calming message? How do you follow up in a way that supports those who were harmed in an interaction? And especially in IPV situations, intimate partner violence situations, both parties, as healing and support is especially necessary to transform situations where the parties are have sustained engagement. In my de-escalation of the fight between the lovers, I knew my best traits to engage were sincerity, sternness, and empathy. And trainings teach, you know, your how to engage with your personal kind of the traits that are best for you. You know, are you funny? Are you big? Are you? Do you have elder authority? Are you young and you know, maybe your youthfulness would help people kind of move out of anger. I'm not particularly funny or physically imposing, so I just go with sternness, sincerity, empathy. And in the breaks between agitation, the calm openings, I stress the urgency of separation for the day. In the moments taken over by the chaos of anger, all that could be done was an attempt to create buffers between the two parties. We swiped the femme lover into the subway station, hoping that the physical bars would facilitate temporary separation. In the Rockaway subway station, where the stillness of the dependable train delay required everyone to witness the commotion rather than keep it moving, it was ultimately the sustained outside attention and my wife's unrelenting company that abated the tension. I collected both of their phone numbers so that I could verify that they were safe and separate that night and refer them to a caring check-in from someone in the collective. Those who undergo safety training also learn how to identify violence. So while some forms of violence are easily spotted, others are subtle, especially when in your own peer group or romantic relationship or social structure. The violence of the state can be especially veiled. This remains true regardless of how obvious the effects are, the unavailability of fresh food in my food desert, the early death of my people, the school to prison pipeline. Every training offers a theoretical and speculative introduction, which offers us not only a deeper grounding in the work, but also ownership over the why engage. The SOS Collective expanded the definition of violence during a community freestyle on space violence in 2014, which was really to talk about gentrification. And that conceptual expansion transforms collective members from passive victims of displacement to active participants in combating neighborhood correction, a form of violence that's experienced by the majority of those involved in the local anti-violence movement. Gentrification limits the number of safe spaces, and I see I'm getting toward 15 minutes, so one more minute, please, and thank you. Gentrification limits the number of safe spaces available in a neighborhood for queer people of African descent. The rising cost of rent, both residential and commercial, means that not only are the old faces gone, but also the longtime local business owners who develop personal relationships with residents, straight or queer. As soon as we trained a business for the Safe Neighborhood campaign, it closed down. As soon as it closed down, a new sign erected, often something in French or Italian, with another class of clientele in mind. The new spaces transformed Black people into an indistinguishable, undesirable mass, even when purporting queer friendliness, like the new cafe on my block, which hosts RuPaul drag nights for an all-white audience. When I attempted the de-escalation in front of the cafe, the range of tactics that I could use were limited. The white-only nature of the cafe renovated it from a potential safe space that could aid in the intervention into hostile territory that could invite violence workers at any moment. Queer community organizing that centers transformative justice and community accountability holds the potential to radically reimagine our sense of deservingness. A collective struggle against the state and structural space violence of gentrification amplifies the message that everybody deserves bodily integrity, livable shelter, a clean environment, food, and community. So what does penal abolition mean to Safe Outside the System and Audre Lorde Project? It means ridding the community not only of institutions of violence and corrections, but of the perpetual punishment of African bodies in the United States. It means enabling life-affirming institutions and practices that rehumanize us after slavery and colonization. And this is Abolition, reimagined by queer collectivity in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you.
Great. So I think we have a good amount of time for questions from the audience. These were such rich and thought-provoking presentations. Wow. So let's get everyone ready. I'm not sure if Kanav, are you with us? Okay. Great. So my first question, one second. And I urge everyone to go ahead and sort of type your question in the chat, and we will do our best to sort of pick them up and have you present your questions to the speakers. So before we turn into what an abolitionist imagination can manifest, I first want to ask you, from each of your perspectives, right, the perspectives you've brought to us, describe how hard and even impossible it might be for some individuals, particularly I want to speak to the Black communities that we're talking about, to create any sort of agency over the macro and systemic oppression that your presentation describes. If my question is not clear, let me know and I'll rephrase it without taking up any more time.
I'm sorry, I don't necessarily need you to rephrase it, but could you actually just say it again for me? I missed the very beginning part of that.
So before we dive into what an abolitionist imagination can manifest, I want us to sit with the problem itself that you're all describing. And I want you to see, in a way, to describe how impossible sort of the oppression that people are facing is, and how agency is made even harder to develop within, I want to speak to Black and African communities, but yeah, does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So sure. You know, I think it's easy to maybe be overwhelmed by the impossibility of a situation, particularly marked by state violence. And particularly if you're talking about the United States as your state, which, you know, obviously militarized police force, seemingly endless resources to crush you. It can be really hard. And so I think that a really crucial step is to do what you can to have community get together. And so things like community freestyles that that Audre Lorde Project does. This isn't just one. I mean, Audre Lorde Project has many types of events, many gatherings for community members. But I think what's really, really beautiful and what I really cherish in particularly areas that can be, you know, broad stroke kind of defined as low income areas and, you know, really tough places to live in and, you know, marked by state violence, marked by a lot of repression, marked by absence and deficit and deficit and deficit. And I think, you know, what I find really special about the neighborhood is that AOP isn't alone. Like if you talk to people, there are just dozens and dozens of community organizing centers. There are so many people who are out there. And so to me, I think it's not so much that agency feels hard to develop. I think that agency is there and that Black folks like and I'm not speaking for all the community. I can't speak for you know, I can't even speak for the South. I can't speak for, you know, anywhere else really outside of like, you know, I know what Brooklyn has going on. I know what Philly has going on. And then it's like question mark, question mark. But what I'll say is that I find it really inspiring and really special just to see exactly how agentic people are. Like everyday folks are out there. They're the ones who are, you know, in the protests, who are joining. And I don't necessarily mean, you know, the coordinating or the nonprofit positions. I mean, you know, who's there and who's protecting each other and how, and who's really like forming these ways to shelter others from cops. And, you know, it's, to me, I think, yeah, we can see it and we can feel disheartened, you know, when harm comes our way. But the really beautiful thing about being people of African descent is that, wow, you know, we have what Natalie Otoke says is a resilient vitality. We have had many opportunities to sharpen a resilient vitality. And I think, you know, call me an optimist, but that's the way I see my people.
And I want to give other folks a chance to respond to the question. I know there's a couple more coming into the chat. And I just want to qualify really quickly that I wasn't coming in from a pessimist necessarily, but I just wanted us to sit with the problem before we dove into sort of any sort of solutions. But anyone else?
Maybe I can just say a few words. I'm not really probably the best person to give an answer to this type of question, but what I would actually point to is, despite all the police murders of people in Toronto, Canada, over my political history, so I'm going back to the 70s through to today, and the incredible police brutality and anti-Black racism that you've seen in the police, that there's always been a history of organizing and resistance on the part of people within the Black communities, especially initiated by Black feminists and especially Black lesbian feminists who've actually sustained some of these struggles. I'm going back to the Black Action Defense Committee, Sharona Hall, people who actually were able to sustain major forms of resistance, which obviously was reignited with the Black Lives Matter movement and even taking on broader forms in relationship to what I still would describe as the global uprising against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and police violence and brutality. So I just wanted to remark on that. Despite all those difficulties, and I certainly understand what many of them are, there's been this history of resistance and self-organizing that has inspired other people and has eventually forced some white people, including some white queer people, to actually recognize what's going on and to actually respond with a sort of politics of responsibility to those calls for racial and social justice. I think I'll just leave it there.
I can add a few things. Certainly not speaking on behalf of anyone or any community, but I guess in thinking of resistance and agency, I'm thinking of resistance on the outside, in spaces of food apartheid, and resistance on the inside in prisons. And I think agency on the outside, you know, we really position urban agriculture, specifically urban farms working towards Black land and food sovereignty. And that's a term that's, you know, I borrow from Eric Jackson from Black Yield Institute here in Baltimore, as well as the Black Church Food Security Network, who are doing this work. So I think, you know, there's certainly formal sites of resistance and agency, such as these urban farms. There's also informal, everyday forms of resistance, which Ashante Reese's work speaks to. Black Food Matters, Black Food Geographies. On the inside, you know, there's a lot to get into, but we know, you know, hunger strikes are such a predominant form of organizing. But I guess even outside of that, there are ways in which people use food to care. on the inside on an everyday basis, whether it's, sharing meals, sharing commissary, pooling commissary together, and kind of reproducing some of the social relations that, every aspect of prison works so hard to just destroy. Yeah, so I'll keep it at that.
Okay, thank y'all for your answers. I'm gonna try to read some of the questions in the chat, but one of the things, just quickly about that question, is I think we have to bring back the voice of Stevie Wilson, right, who told us that sometimes these resistances and the way people deploy agency gets co-opted and is used to ameliorate the status of the system. And so instead of glorifying these sort of small scale forms of resistances, we probably have to shift our language to figure out how to wage an effective abolitionist attack that is not incremental justice, but immediate justice. All right, so the question that I see in the chat right now is framed like this. For the third presentation, removal of Black residents relies on police brutality, which makes the Black person look like a threat. Do you agree with Brittany Cooper's idea that visibility and a disrespectful politics is a viable solution to this problem? Or do you think this interferes with the de-escalation strategies you discussed?
So I don't know the context in which visibility is discussed, by Brittany Cooper, but in terms of how I think about visibility, I tend to appreciate the sociological examinations of visibility that frame visibility as one strategy that exists alongside strategic invisibility. And I write about this in my first book, The Economies of Queer Inclusion, that essentially it's up to queer people of color to think through very carefully what visibility means and in what context it matters or may be useful or not useful. And I'd like to think through, I don't give blanket kind of answers about visibility being good or bad or useful or not useful, because it's so situational. And because we should really understand visibility both as a tactic that we can use individually, but also as an organizational tactic that queer organizations are constantly contending with in the public. When and where do I share X, Y, and Z, right, aspect of self? And I think Black queer organizations take this up in ways that are, well, I share the work of Safe Outside the System because it's a collective I've worked with for the last decade. And it's my political home in a lot of ways. So I'll just say very specifically with them that Safe Outside the System does security work for protests, or rallies for families who have lost someone to police violence, for example. And at any protest or rally, we're dealing with usually a lot, kind of high amount of police officers there, a large number of police officers. So what does it mean to be kind of visibly queer in that situation can look very different than what it means to be visibly queer at a gay pride rally, right? And so sometimes it can be very meaningful for us to show up in full-scale queerness, to be the people who are interacting with the cops on behalf of a Black straight man, right? And that does something really beautiful also for community relations, community relationships, right? And the possibility of coalitions. So I'll say that, I'll just say that, and kind of very briefly with the disrespectful politics, that's in position or in relationship to respectability politics, which we know has actually done a lot of harm to queer Black people. And I think, you know, even situating respectability politics historically as something that the mainstream civil rights movement upheld, they did that and simultaneously silenced the queer Black people that were a part of the civil rights movement and that were actually intellectually and tactically at the forefront of leadership for civil rights. And so I do agree that visibility and disrespectful politics have really important, or that they're important considerations for us when we are in the streets, when we're trying to survive, when we're organizing for each other, et cetera.
Great. I guess while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, maybe I missed a few. I just wanted to ask how you all sort of respond to the demand of abolishing civilizing violence, right, through the presentations that you brought to us. So how do you react to that particular title?
I can say something if people want. My notion of what civilization is a racist, colonialist, imperialist project, right? So I think that what is then characterized as civilization is actually about violence, about colonialism, about racism, right? So if we're talking about abolishing sort of civilizing violence, then I think it's actually something that I would be in favor of. But I mean, I think that needs to then be concretized in relationship to more specific settings of what we're talking about, because clearly the police are part of that civilizing violence. Prisons are part of that civilizing violence. Carceral relations are part of that civilizing violence. Capitalism is intrinsically, and colonialism and imperialism are intrinsically part of that. So we actually have to talk about what that actually means for our practice on a day-to-day basis in terms of developing both an abolitionist form of resistance and politics of transformation, but also the types of alternatives we're trying to build, right? So, but I mean, other people have certain takes on what civilization is. I mean, in some ways, you know, I don't know if people are familiar with Norbert Elias's work. This is a little bit dated, but he actually described the civilizing process as this process of violence, right? As this process of constructing something called civilization that was actually based on the exclusion and repression of all sorts of other people. I mean, even to think of something like a table, which is right in front of me, as a piece of civilizing violence. Well, in some ways, tables were developed so that you could separate the higher parts of the body from the lower parts of the body, right? Because the lower parts of the body were supposed to be really awful and need to be hidden from other people when you were actually engaging in the civilizing process of eating in this respectable, responsible fashion. So, I mean, there's all sorts of different dimensions of this. So I think it resonates a lot with my talk. So we actually need to talk about how do we get rid of that civilizing form of violence, and how do we actually build alternatives that are based on different forms of human connection, social caring, mutual aid, and social solidarity that obviously puts support for people and our needs at the center. So yes, it does resonate with my talk quite a bit. Thank you.
Anyone else want to react to the title?
No, I just wanted to, I agree with everything you said, Gary. Appreciate your answer. I don't think there's anything meaningful I could add. Just wanted to, show gratitude for that.
Ditto. The question in the chat, though, I definitely want to hear.
Okay, great. Let me see. Okay, question about food prison. Does one person going on food strike improve the food, or several people striking cause an effective change on the food they are given? I'm not reformist, but what can we do right now to help them get safe, healthy food? And how does abolition connect to food? So this is a pretty direct question. So
I think that's a good question. So there's many directions to go with that, and there's certainly multiple questions in that one as well. So one person going on strike versus multiple versus does the action of a strike have meaningful impacts on food? I think one, we just have to look at the we have to look at strikes almost like, yes, we can look at them in their totality, but also just the specific instances and the outcomes of each of those instances. I think, in Maryland, there's a number of people on a hunger strike right now, actually, and that's really not well publicized. I want to say that the state's backlash to those on hunger strikes can sometimes be even more sadistic and brutalizing than the regular everyday brutality of prison. For example, I'm thinking of a specific instance. I believe it was an Australian detention center, but I might be wrong, of where incarcerated folks, a group of incarcerated folks were force-fed in like a really brutal manner, where folks were kept on the brink of life and death through the state's desire to not almost choose one option or the other. So in that sense, it's certainly not as clear-cut of an answer as like, okay, people go on strike and there's, and we obviously know all of the instances of strikes that result in death, that result in violence, that result in murder on the inside. So I think it's certainly a complicated question. I think to your point earlier, Cheryl, that like, we have to differentiate between like, I guess, an abolitionist form of resistance through food versus, people trying to survive on the inside. In that sense, for folks I've spoken with in Maryland, hunger strikes and just strikes in general certainly do have some effectiveness in changing food conditions, even if they're not, formal strikes, but people just throwing their food on the ground, sending it back, making noise. And that's not necessarily an abolitionist endeavor by any means, but again, it is a form of resistance in some capacity. I'm just looking at the second part of your question. Yeah, I didn't speak to this in my talk, but our praxis does try to answer that question in terms of what can we do right now, to improve food conditions on the inside. Again, we really center the urban farm, specifically the urban farm working towards Black land and food sovereignty as one means of building communal self-determination on the outside. And by almost like mediating that relationship with the state to improve food conditions on the inside. I think one of the most important things to do when talking about prison food, and that's what my first part of the presentation was about, is positioning prison food for what it actually is, right? And not advocating for this kinder, gentler prison where we can, all have access to all the fresh foods or whatever we need. So yeah, I'll stop there for now.
I'm not sure if, I think what's in the chat are a couple of comments. So I encourage folks who have not already asked a question to go ahead and drop their question in the chat. I guess this is a great time to ask if any of the panelists, right, would like to sort of engage with each other's ideas directly while we wait for a couple more questions to come in.
I was wondering if I could take up one of the questions that was in the chat a little bit earlier that related specifically to my talk.
Okay, go for it.
It was twofold, and I'll try and be really brief. One was in the specific Canadian context, and I mean, there's connections and differences between the Canadian territories and what's gone on south of from our vantage point, south of the border. But one was around Indigenous struggles. And what I was talking about was if you actually see the existing Canadian state, which is based on the genocide and colonization of Indigenous people, as the framework for your rights and liberation, which is what the mainstream of the LGBT movement, for lack of a better expression, has adopted in the Canadian context, it does mean that it leads to an opposition in practice to the indigenous struggles that are going on that actually are contesting the character of that social form of state formation. I'll just give you one example. One of the mainstream groups in Canada called EGAL talks a lot about two-spirit people, right? Has written reports that sort of really focus on two-spirit people, but they systematically separate two-spirit people from that history of colonialism, racism, genocide, and violence, right? So it's like two-spirit people somehow exist outside that history of colonization and violence, when of course, going after third and fourth gender groupings was central to the colonizing racist practices of the European colonizers, right? And trying to wipe out those practices. So that was one question. So if you, for instance, in the United States, if you actually accept that the framework of the US state as the form for your rights and liberation, it does have consequences in terms of what does that mean for your ability to be in solidarity with Indigenous people's struggles. So I think it's of relevance there. The other question was, why is it some LGBT groups are still sort of stuck in the reform the police perspective? It has an awful lot to do with their racialized class interests, right? There's the people at the top who've risen to the top of our communities. Sometimes the people who benefited the most from the mass struggles at the base actually are interested in collaboration with the police because they own private property. They want the police to protect it. They fear Black people and other people of color and Indigenous people, and they want the police to protect them. I'll just end off with one comment. Because of the focus of No Pride in Policing Coalition in Toronto and our organizing of a rally to defund and abolish all police on Pride Day last year in the city of Toronto, which attracted about 3,000 people and probably about the same number online. One of the sort of older white gay men, a lawyer, who's actually played significant roles in the mainstream LGBT movement, said, "We are being erased." So the question is, who is this we that's being erased? Well, he's really talking about white middle-class people and an inability to actually grasp how Black, Indigenous, and people of color, queer and trans people are actually central now and have been central to the making of our movements and communities. So I'll end off there. So it has a lot to do with class and racialized interests.
Okay, I think there's another question in the chat. I don't know if, do you want to come on screen to sort of explain your question a little bit? I don't know if, yes.
Hello.
Okay. Are you comfortable being on screen or having your voice recorded?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, so thank you all for your time. I'm just curious what the role of narcissistic abuse or interpersonal relationship violence, and then looking at how some of the themes that are common on an interpersonal level, like narcissistic abuse, has that been something that you've looked at in tying to how system level violence operates? You know, it could show like a correlation of like themes between individual and systemic oppression, and potentially, you know, and I think really allow for that regardless of whatever the tools are used and operated, that it's the same pattern of violence. Have you considered, you know, using this framework of analysis in the past or for the future with which to see these cycles of like divide and conquer violence? Thank you.
Okay, just really quickly, I do note that we are almost at time. We're gonna try to answer this question, and there's another question as well. So I wanted to ask, Jen, are you comfortable coming on screen and asking your question, and then we'll let folks answer both of them at the same time? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
I'll answer very quickly in saying that, yes, I don't use the framework of narcissistic abuse, but in my articulation of corrective violence, I do talk about many forms of interpersonal violence that I believe mirror the same corrective aim that the state attempts to or like has as an underlying logic for how and why they harm queer or deviant bodies. And so I use the parallel or a conversation of quote unquote corrective rape as one of those, which is a form of rape that's usually described as an intraracial form of rape in South African literature against lesbians, Black lesbians. But it's actually something that we see in many cultures, many spaces. And I think, but it's this idea that you can harm someone, you can do some type of sexual violence to them in order to make them straight, or teach them that that is not the right way, right? And in many ways, that same form of violence, even though that would be, you know, interpersonal violence, it mirrors the state's mandate entirely in that it enacts violence against a body in order to make it straight, right? In order to make it act the way that the state would like this person to act in society. And I think that's the logic of corrections, correctional facilities, and carceral violence in general.
So I just want to offer a quick, I guess, trigger warning. I do realize that some of these conversations are bringing up topics that might be triggering for some. And so we do encourage that you bring in critiques to the session on where the organizing team will be open to sort of hearing that particular feedback. I want to just sort of be mindful of time. If there are any last remarks or closing thoughts from our panelists, please go ahead and we will close the session.
I'll just say to my fellow panelists, it was really wonderful to hear from both of you. I'm just absolutely pleased to see how our talks connected, how our missions connect. It's really lovely.
And I entirely agree. So it was great meeting both of you virtually. And I think the conversation has actually been quite generative, and hopefully we'll be able to continue these discussions in other contexts in the future.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to the organizers as well. Thank you, Sharon, Cheryl, for moderating too.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for participating in this conversation. And I implore you all to click on those 3 little buttons on the chat, download some of the questions that we might not have gotten into. And if it is possible, please submit some additional questions through the email. And if the panelists are open to it, we can send them your questions and repost their answers on the website and keep the conversation going. At this time, I really have nothing more to add. So thank you all so much for coming, and see you hopefully at some of the next sessions.